I'm less than 10 episodes into my podcast and I'm already releasing a follow-up. What is going on here? For those of you who've been watching, you know that one of my first interviews on this show was with a local advocate for approval voting. His name is Logan Bowers, and you can go rewatch that episode. We had a great conversation where I asked him all about approval voting and why he thought it would be a good fit for the city of Seattle.
Approval voting's awesome simply because it does a really good job of picking winners that match the voter intent.
To be honest, I went into that conversation not really knowing anything about approval voting on purpose because I wanted to give the audience a chance to learn about it with me. And I walked away from that conversation feeling pretty good about the idea. I even ended the video by saying that I would fully support approval voting or ranked choice voting if I got the option here in Seattle. But in the weeks after I posted that conversation, I started seeing some discourse on Twitter where people were pushing back against the idea of approval voting. There seemed to be a lot of concern that approval voting, while good in theory, might not work as well in practice as we hope. Specifically, there was a lot of concern that approval voting might further marginalize some groups of voters, particularly communities of color. As far as I'm concerned, the entire point of any voting reform is to make things better, to make it so that more people feel like they're properly represented and less people feel like they're falling through the cracks. So if it is true that approval voting is going to make things worse or have unintended racial implications, then implementing it could be a big mistake. So I reached out to today's guest, Kamau Chege, who's an organizer with the Washington Community Alliance, an organization focused specifically on building a multiracial democracy and helping to make sure that people of color have fair representation. Kamau was taking a leading role on the Twitter discourse criticizing approval voting, and he was also recommended by Fair Vote Washington as somebody who could speak knowledgeably on this topic. So it was a real treat to get to sit down and pick his brain on this topic. I hope you enjoy it too. So I am sitting here with Kamau Chege, who is an organizer with the Washington Community Alliance, also a board member with the Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project, and a few other organizations focused on creating equity and better voting rights for people. Yeah.
Thanks for having me, Zach.
Does that summarize it pretty well?
Yeah. That's a good summary of the work.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join me here. I'm very interested in having this conversation. So basically the background on this is I personally was interested in ranked choice voting. It was something that I learned about during my time working with the Andrew Yang campaign.
Mm-hmm.
That's something he really pushes, and I was basically like, this seems like a great idea. Seems like it would help make democracy work a little better. And it was something I was kind of like passively supporting. And then I saw the posters around town for the approval voting measure. And I was like, I haven't really heard about this. I don't really know anything about it, but it seems like maybe it's trying to push for something similar, so I'd love to learn more about it. So that's when I reached out to, I actually reached out through the poster. I followed the link on the poster. I reached out to the organization. They're the ones that put me in touch with Logan. And he was basically like, yeah, I'd love to come and talk to you about it. And I sat down, I had a conversation with him. I don't know if you got the chance to watch that conversation or not.
Not yet. Not all of it.
That's totally fine. But yeah, so it was kind of the kind of thing where I went into it intentionally, not having done too much research because I wanted to have it all be fresh for the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I had the conversation, I mean, a lot of what he said sounded pretty good, where I was like, yeah, in a lot of ways this does sound better. And I kind of walked away from that conversation feeling like I don't know ultimately if one is better than the other when it comes to like ranked choice voting or approval voting, but I felt like both of these seem better than what we have now. And that's kind of how I ended that episode, was like, from what I can tell, both these seem like good improvements. One might be better than the other, but either way, this seems like a step forward. And it wasn't until a couple weeks after I had posted that I started to see the discussion forming on Twitter, where people were starting to push back on the approval voting.
I should go back and watch that interview.
I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on it, but I'll try my best to kind of bring up the points that he brought up, because I did try to at least like bring up the issue of how approval voting might squeeze out certain voices. And he had his own responses to that, which I'll try to bring up here. But I also think it would be interesting at some point to have you and Logan talk together. But first, I thought it'd be great to just hear your point of view, where you come from on this, and why you think that approval voting might not be the best fit for Seattle. But before we jump into the approval voting stuff, could we start by just hearing your background? Where do you come from, and how did you get involved in voting rights, and how did this become an important issue to you?
Yeah, I think that is a kind of a good place to start. So for me, I started organizing around immigrant rights after high school for a campaign for the Washington State Dream Act that would have allowed people to have equal access to state financial aid to higher education, regardless of their immigration status. And then from that campaign, an effort pushing for comprehensive immigration reform, and then later on, especially after the Bernie campaign in 2016, into more efforts for electoral politics. So the Congressman Pramila Jayapal's campaign, but also co-founding a PAC that would run progressive candidates on a populist but big tent movement. And so it was called All of Us PAC. And we ran candidates like Tom Perriello for governor in Virginia, helped out on other campaigns, Cori Bush's first run in St. Louis, and then after a while merged with Justice Democrats. And I came away from that effort thinking that we were really onto something insofar as there being a real need for a progressive movement talking about multiracial democracy in the United States, how short that experiment has been, basically 1965 to 2000, and then really waning after that. And how important of a project that is, probably the most important civic project of our generation and kind of this time. And so when I saw an opportunity to lead what was then the Washington Census Alliance, a coalition of organizations of color and tribes working to get complete count in the 2020 census, I thought that was going to be a really important opportunity to talk about the fact that we live in a country where the only place in the Constitution that even acknowledged the presence of people of color was actually the Census Clause, those counting Black people as less than a full person, not counting Native Americans at all because of the campaign of genocide that was happening at the time. And if you could get people to understand the census not just as some sort of like bureaucratic thing that happens once every 10 years, but actually a very important moment to reflect on what kind of democracy we have, how inclusive is it, and why do we need an inclusive multiracial democracy in order to have the kind of prosperity and growth generated and distributed in as equitable a way as possible, which is, I think, something that most people agree with. That, we first needed to make sure that everybody was counted in it. And it was really successful. We took Washington State from being among the bottom 30 states in self-response to having the second highest rate of self-response in 2020 and leading the country. And then since then, a lot of the organizations wanted to build on that success by working on other campaigns for multiracial democracy. So we support them in leading their work on redistricting, but also as kind of like short-term advances in advancing democracy, and then long-term projects to get the solutions we feel we need, like proportional representation or ranked choice voting. And I'm sure that's a lot of stuff we'll talk about today.
Absolutely. Before we move on, I'm curious, you said that in around 2000, things started dwindling in this aspect. So what happened around 2000?
I mean, I think the 2000 presidential election was a really important turning point because that's where you start to see a huge decline in trust in American institutions, on a scale that we really haven't seen since Gallup and other big pollsters have been measuring it. And it's not an accident that it takes place when you have the Electoral College that's built on the census count in each state and the states rather than the popular vote come into conflict with where the majority of the country was, because that's kind of our system right now, right? We have a majoritarian. We talk about our system as if it's majoritarian when it's actually very majoritarian in a very narrow sense. And so as soon as you saw that discrepancy between Bush winning the Electoral College, Gore winning the popular vote, it going up to the Supreme Court, and 9 people appointed basically arbitrarily on the basis of when certain former members either died or strategically retired, got to select who the winner of the election was, as they interpreted a document that was created at a time when millions of people that voted in that election were not allowed to vote. I think that was like a huge turning point in people's trust in our democracy. Importantly, I think people forget that when the country was founded, the first election, only 6% of the population was eligible to vote. And we have those same institutions right now for governing a country that, for the most part, tries to strive for universal suffrage. And I think that's why ever since then, with a few exceptions, you've seen rapidly declining trust in our democracy, because people kind of do see that the institutions aren't set up to work for them. Single choice elections are not the way are not the best way to decide, and a national government that's not representative of the people it governs over can't have the credibility needs to govern.
So, I mean, back in the olden days, back in history, it seems like it was very clear to see like how people were being pushed out. Like you were saying, like there were very clear, blatant laws saying like women can't vote, and these things at this point, those very obvious, glaring things, we've done something about. What are some of the less obvious ways that some voters are being pushed out these days?
I think a lot of it is structural. So people just intuitively know that zero-sum elections for some people are something that they aren't interested in participating in, and that's made worse by a lot of negative campaigning and those kinds of things. So there are people who are just like turned off by politics because it looks like a mess. That's a very subtle way, all the way down to the fact that when you have a winner-take-all system like we do right now, there are voting blocks that have a kind of collective vested interest. So you could think of like tribes in Washington State, people who live on reservations, where it's important for them to have a voice as a collective group. Or Black voters. Like there's a reason why those groups vote 80%, 90% for the same candidate or type of politics. There's like a history behind that. And so when you have a situation like we have today where there isn't a single city council district in the state, Washington State, or county council district or jurisdiction where those communities can elect their candidates of choice. That's disenfranchising on its own for the voters who are trying to vote there, but also for people who kind of intuitively get that they don't really have a shot at getting representation, so they never make the first moves like, why register to vote? If you live in, Franklin County, you haven't seen representation the whole time you've been there. Your parents, you watch your parents think about voting, or maybe voted in a few elections. They didn't see any representation, and you go on down the line. You might not be so convinced by an organizer that comes to you with a clipboard and a voter registration form saying, hey, voting is actually really important. This is the most important election of our lifetimes. And I think you saw a couple cycles where people like Bernie Sanders, even like Andrew Yang, like really tapped into the kind of slice of those people who thought, yeah, maybe this time I'll give it a shot. But what you want is a system that's set up to give people that shot on a reliable and consistent basis, not just when there's, charismatic guys or kind of once in a lifetime political moment. Like, that's what democracy is about at the end of the day.
Yeah. So, again, before we quite get into the approval voting stuff, did the Washington Community Alliance evolve out of these other kind of organizations that you were talking about previously, or was it kind of a separate thing? So, yeah, did it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the first idea was people were seeing an active campaign of count suppression, which is people can think about it as like pre-gerrymandering, because the census count informs how many districts, congressional districts there are, and because that count also informs how the district, it's the data for drawing district boundaries. And in a winner-take-all system, those district boundaries are really, really important. You can basically manipulate the outcome, especially when we have polarization at the levels that we do, by drawing lines the way you want. And so if you're trying to make that work of gerrymandering easier, as a lot of the right, but also just kind of party establishments. It's not like the Democratic Party establishment has like a great track record of putting other groups' interests above their own. Then suppressing the actual count so that people aren't even in the data set that is the basis for drawing those lines, becomes a really big tool for suppressing people's political voices. So those organizations were seeing that kind of danger, and a lot of declining social trust and trust in our institutions, and create this campaign to get out the count. And then out of that came an effort to think about, why not do year-round organizing? And there's a lot of issues with our democracy. So let's not just have a campaign that comes and goes, but have a network that can support all of our organizations in advancing multiracial democracy. And so then that's when Washington Census Alliance transformed into Washington Community Alliance. And then what we do is provide logistical support for our member organizations to take on campaigns that are around multiracial democracy. So some of our members were really interested in the census because of redistricting, and we supported them in creating Redistricting Justice for Washington that was able to double the amount of majority minority districts by voting age population. Still not proportional, right? Because people of color are almost 40% of the state. But going from 4 to 8 was pretty important. There's others that are part of Washington for Equitable Representation that works on voting reforms like ranked choice voting, proportional representation, public financing of elections. And then other members that work on immigrant rights when it comes to access to social programs, Washington Immigrant Relief Fund. And our Black Lung members work on Project for Police Accountability and progressive revenue and public investment in communities, Washington for Black Lives, and then we also coordinate other outreach, like for the expanded child tax credit or vaccines or other things that are really pressing issues in our members' communities.
It's a lot of really important stuff. So it's great to hear that there are, steady organizations and not just based on the current election cycle that are actually continuously pushing on that. It's fantastic to hear that.
Thanks.
So let's get into it a little bit now. With approval voting and ranked choice voting, both of these, I mean, the appeal of them and the thing that they market themselves for is kind of what you're talking about in terms of like, ideally, these would eliminate that, stealing a vote from the major candidate thing. That's the appeal, is being able to vote for that long shot candidate that you think is right without being accused of throwing away your vote. But why is this maybe not as simple as it seems, and why might approval voting maybe have some unforeseen consequences?
I think you have to think about what problem are you trying to solve? And I think that's kind of the first place where approval voting starts to go wrong. So you can think of like the problems with the Institutions for American Democracy, right? It's kind of twofold. One is single choice elections, which are not most people's preference. Most people have all sorts of preferences. They have all sorts of views on different issues, some of which contradict them, each other. But that's not to say that they're not smart either. Like, those are deeply held values, and people are trying to work through them. You can find, your most like credentialed politician, and they'll have views that contradict each other.
Paradoxes.
Right. So that's one thing. People want more choices, just kind of intuitively. But single choice elections are also very bad when you have you're trying to build multiracial democracy, because you have different groups with different histories and different issues, and some you want to be like really cognizant of. Like, if you have a country that enslaved people and had a campaign of genocide and then a long legacy of racism that continues to this day, you don't want single choice elections that create a kind of zero-sum politics where you can have like a one-way ratchet of polarization. You want some way to have productive disagreements, and you want political conflicts to be able to be sorted out in non-zero-sum ways, and to have kind of a continuous debate and conversation. Okay. You also want proportional representation, which is to say you don't want a winner-take-all system for kind of all the reasons I just talked about. Because you end up in zero-sum situations. You end up in situations where one group has, power that is disproportionate to disproportionate at the expense of other communities. Like, not great when you're living in a country with a lot of racial divisions and a long history of racism. So you have to start out from kind of thinking about, do I want to address that problem? Do I think that that is the main problem in American democracy? And if you do, then solutions like ranked choice voting that let people rank their preferences and have backup choices and be able to vote for candidates or version of politics that might not be their own, but are things that they're open to without risking their first choice preference.
Yeah.
It gives people an out rather than for them to be cornered in. It allows for the right incentives for politicians, which is to be talking positively about themselves and even other people who are running for the same office as them, rather than the incentives in a zero-sum system where if they bring down a candidate or a political movement, that's just as good as kind of bringing themselves up. And if they can scapegoat a minority group and create negative polarization, that is good for them. So you don't want that situation. Approval voting, as I understand it, isn't really I'm not sure they're concerned about that. It's a very, young movement, right? It's a lot of highly educated, people largely from the tech industry, who are really obsessed about like mathematical models. And have found that, well, if you run models under this kind of voting system, you end up with better outcomes, like running regressions on a spreadsheet. And I think for them, the problems that they're trying to solve are politics seems too complicated. And if people have contradictory views, then they kind of don't know what they're talking about. So you need to really like dumb down the system. You really need to like simplify the system and say, hey, why don't we just say who everybody approves of, or who most people approve of, and go with that. And it's a kind of tolerance model of trying to just not even think about people's preferences at all. Like that, they just kind of think that's the wrong way to go. You're going to get tons of conflict. Let's focus on tolerance. And I think over the last few years, people who've been following racial justice movements in the US have kind of learned like, oh, tolerance might not be this great thing that we thought it was when our third grade teacher told us about being tolerant to one another. Maybe acknowledging people's differences is really important. So I think almost like from the very jump, approval voting gets that really wrong, that the problem in American democracy as it is right now is it doesn't have the incentives or institutions for being an inclusive multiracial democracy. And that is the problem. And so, yeah. And I think also, they've kind of landed themselves in this funny place where by articulating the problem as one of, by just basically creating like a new metric for assessing politics and the health of democracies, how many people approve of a candidate, how approved is a certain brand of politics. They've then backed out and found a system that meets up, that like meets their metric the best, and then started to measure everything else against this metric that they created that they think is the best way to measure how well an electoral system functions. And I think that's really misguided. I mean, anybody who has ever tried to analyze a game knows that, yeah, if you can create whatever metric you want and then back out, whatever system you want to have it have the highest score against that metric. But that's a kind of really circular way of thinking about things rather than trying to think about the fundamentals and the problem you're trying to solve rather than, something that seems great on paper.
So one of the points that Logan brought up when I tried to talk to him about this was, the argument being made is that people will tend with approval voting to approve the person that gets the most approval votes is probably going to be kind of the most, I guess, watered down or the most moderate, the person the most in the middle. Maybe everyone's second choice, or everyone's third choice, but nobody's first choice, But one of the things that Logan kind of said to counteract that, or at least his take, was that on the other hand, it would change kind of the way people vote in terms of like he used Andrew Grant Houston as an example of somebody who maybe would have gotten more votes from the general populace because the people who really liked him maybe would only vote for him because it was that important to them. But to your average voter who doesn't really pay that close attention to the different candidates, they might vote for that run-of-the-mill guy, but they also might say, oh, well, I can vote for multiple people. Maybe I'll go for this long shot person as well. So in that sense, could it actually help get more votes for the longer shot candidates? Or is there something missing from that?
I mean, sure, there's no reason to think that that might not happen, but that's a little bit of an odd way to think about it. That's just in one election.
Yeah.
And even then, it's an abstract example and it's, hard to say. So I can't really say one way or the other.
A specific candidate, it's going to get muggier like that. But just
Right.
in a general sense, let's say you have a more like long shot candidate who maybe the general public doesn't really see as being viable, but they like him. They just don't see him as viable. I guess the benefit of approval voting would be that you could still give your vote to that candidate you don't really see as viable, and that overall that could make a difference. But do you think that the cons of approval voting and the risks of it outweigh that benefit?
Yeah, especially the long-term risks, because again, you have to think like, is that the problem with our electoral system, that long shot candidates aren't viable? Is the problem with our electoral system that first-time candidates or unconventional candidates don't have as much of a shot? I mean, in some ways, it's it's very much of like it's a way of thinking for people who are very interested in politics, who are maybe themselves like politics. Like, I think it's fine to hear because Logan himself was a city council candidate. Yeah. So that might be the way that you think about it. It's like, how do you make the electoral system better for first-time candidates?
And I can only imagine if you have been in that position.
Yeah, that's top of mind.
Going to
And
influence, yeah.
right. So yeah, sure. Maybe that is it. Maybe it's not. We've only had 2 approval elections in the U.S. I think in 2019 and 2020. 2019 for Fargo and 2020 for St. Louis, and the mayoral candidate was one who had, I believe she had ran before. She was very well known. I lived in St. Louis when I was younger, and just did fine. So it wasn't exactly an instance where long shot candidates got a good shot about it. The way I would think about the electoral system is from the voter's perspective. Like, for voters, it's about, do I have an equal voice? Can I make my voice heard? And am I able to communicate the full range of my preferences with the system? It's almost like, the way if you're designing like an app or business, you can think about an app or business by like, what's going to be good for the builders. But people who've done that before know that you should be thinking about it from what's it like for the user. And the big problem I would say with an election like that is the outcome would be determined by a slim plurality of the Seattle electorate, right? So even in that example where he's talking about Grant Houston, at the end of the day, it's the plurality of voters that will be able to determine not just who comes out of the primary, but who the general election electorate has to choose from. And in Seattle, the plurality of voters are, especially primary voters, are more disproportionately college educated, disproportionately wealthier than the rest of the city, and disproportionately white. So if what you're trying to say is voters who are disproportionately wealthy, homeowners, college educated, and white would give Andrew Grant Houston a shot, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to argue with that. I don't know. And, Logan doesn't know either. But that's not the problem. To me, the problem is like, why do we have a system where college educated, wealthier, homeowning white people have a disproportionate voice? That doesn't seem fair. I'm sure if you asked them, they would be like, yeah, I don't want a system where I have a louder voice than anybody else. And then this is where you run into all sorts of downstream issues then, right? Because if you have a primary electorate that looks really different from your general electorate, and even your general electorate is not, completely representative, and there's a huge there are like huge racial gaps between those two electorates, and you essentially have wealthy, college educated white people picking which of the two candidates that a more racially diverse, black and brown, more working class, more renter electorate has to pick from. That's not a great system. So that's kind of a little bit of how I think about it. And then obviously then there's voting rights implications about that. Is it sure seems like this slim plurality is having a louder voice at the expense of those other voters, and what someone has to determine whether that's in compliance with our voting rights protections.
So I want to take a moment to really kind of break down what you're talking about when you talk about how approval voting could disproportionately give some voters more power than others. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I've been really trying to understand this. And this is one of the things when I was talking to Logan, it didn't really sink in at first. Because like he mentioned in our conversation, he mentioned that Washington, has the requirement that we have a 2-candidate general election. And I knew that, but it didn't sink in how that would affect the outcome of these different models, I think especially like someone like myself who's first trying to understand, the differences between what we have now and ranked choice voting and approval voting, you're not also thinking about how that interacts with the primary and a general necessarily, at least when you first hear about the ideas. A lot of these videos that break down these voting methods aren't adding that level to the discussion. But it seems like, from what I understand, it is that law and that requirement that we have a 2-party general that really makes approval voting have dangers in terms of giving disproportionate vote representation to certain blocks of voters.
Yeah.
So like my understanding, to break it down for a person watching, is like if you had like 4 candidates running in a primary election.
Yeah.
And let's say you have your lead candidate is like a moderate Democrat who, let's say, does a lot of performative things that make white people feel good about themselves, but doesn't actually do much to help the black community. They hashtag Black Lives Matter a lot, but they don't actually have any policy platforms that are going to help the black community. And then you have another candidate who's pretty much the same, but he only has a tiny fraction of the vote. And then you have a third candidate who is actually like progressive, actually is speaking to the black community, but maybe he's not as accessible to primary voters.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that with approval voting, the block of voters who voted for that moderate kind of main leading candidate could then also vote for the smaller clone candidate who also does those same kind of ideals and essentially push out the more progressive candidate who actually wanted to help those communities.
Yeah.
Is that a good like kind of breakdown of how the primary and general election kind of warp approval voting?
Yeah, and if you ask leaders in the approval voting movement, it's designed to give centrists a louder voice. And so if you look at really big leaders in that movement, like Clay Shentrup, that co-founded the Center for Election Science, and that's the group that's funding the vast majority of the campaign, something like, almost $200,000 of the just under like $250,000 that they've raised comes from him. He's the, I think, like sixth or seventh highest individual contributor, and that's like, he's happy to say that it tends towards centricism. But that's not also like an abstract centricism, right? Because we live in, a very racially regressive country. So it's not just like, oh, middle of the road, you give some, I give some, and there's a compromise. It's things that actually allow systemic racism to continue unabated, right? With just some of the uglier edges shaved off. I guess to your point that you're raising about the outcomes. So yes, Washington State has a top two system where the top two vote getters in the primary go on to the general. And that makes approval voting, which is already really both untested and the record of it, just from its two elections and when Dartmouth was using it for its alumni and board elections before repealing it, does not have a great track record. It makes it much worse. One thing I'd say is you don't see a lot of the approval voting leaders or, movement makers trying to solve the top two problem, right? Like, I didn't hear about them in Olympia. We just ended a session pushing for the local options bill, which was sponsored by, I think all of the lead sponsors were legislators of color. Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley, who's Black and represents the only legislative district in Washington State where people of color can elect the candidate of their choice. The 37th, Senator Yasmin Trudeau, first Muslim state senator, and Senator Tawana Nobles, the first Black woman in the state senate. They were all pushing to lift the ban on things like proportional representation, things like collapsing the primary and general to one election, to not have that problem, to fix this top two problem. And I didn't really see any of the approval voting advocates in Olympia working on that. And it died just shy of a couple votes. And I don't hear about any plans to solve that. So I have to assume that they're willing to at least have that. They're at the very least happy to have that problem in the foreseeable future, and who knows about after that. The other thing to think about with those, we have kind of that scenario is not all voters have the same incentives, right? So if you are just kind of wealthier, white, maybe even like liberal voter, you're fine with like a lot of options on the range of American politics, right? There's some things that you don't like more than others, but nothing, there's not a whole lot of that spectrum that you see as a danger to you and your community, and the ability for your community to have a voice in our democracy in our country, right? If you're a Black voter, or you're a Muslim voter, or you're Latino or Asian, Pacific Islander, or Native, there's a big part of the spectrum of American politics that actually is a present danger. Both like people who are actively trying to harm your community with policies that are dangerous to you and your community, and people who are not addressing long, lingering structural problems, who might be coded in American politics as kind of like centrist, right? Versus, a kind of spectrum of the politics that actually is willing and ready to go and do the work of not just stopping bad things from happening, but actually trying to advance big structural change in the country that your community is depending on. So when you have an approval voting system like that kind of primary you're talking about, there might only be like one candidate or a few candidates where you that you approve of, right? If you're a voter of color, versus for white voters, there might be a great number. And so they're going to approve of multiple candidates, or they're just going to have a different incentive. Maybe there's going to be other situations where they only approve of one, right? Because they see too many of the candidates are radical, and there's a signal that's sent that there's only one. And so you end up with the problem that the approval voting advocates say they're solving, which is like there's too much gamesmanship in our electoral system. There's too much strategizing that voters do. We need to have a simple system where you just approve of everyone. That's a very if you are a tech executive, and you're white and you're like, sure, that seems like simple to you because there is no, for you, yes, inside of the electoral system you have, approval voting just seem like simple. I approve of a lot of different types of people. Let me just approve of all the ones, send in my ballot, forget about it. But if you're a voter of color, actually now you're thinking about man, on one hand, I would really like this, racially progressive candidate who's going to tackle systemic racism, who's going to tackle all these big issues. But I don't know if the other voters are going to go along with them. So, and I really don't want someone who's pushing to actively harm my community, maybe like a far right candidate, right? So does that voter approve of both the kind of who's determined to be centrist and viable because they really don't want the far extremist candidate? Or do they kind of go for broke and only approve of the candidate that's actually going to deliver on the things that they think are important for their community? So for that voter, actually, now approval voting creates a really complex kind of set of incentives and strategizing that needs to be done. And of course, because approval voting is hyper majoritarian, you only need a plurality of voters to dictate the outcome. They're always going to be sort of a quieter voice to the ones who they can approve for one candidate, they can approve for multiple candidates, really doesn't matter. And that's where a lot of, to me, I see a lot of voting rights implications, but also that's not the kind of system that most people want.
Yeah.
It's important to also think about, I don't know if you want to think about why ranked choice voting would be different in that kind of system. We could talk about that.
Yeah. Before we jump into why ranked choice voting would be different in that kind of system, first of all, I appreciate this a lot because this is a big part of why I wanted to have this conversation, because it did not escape me when I was talking to Logan that I was trying to ask about this kind of stuff, but also, yeah, we're both white, pretty well-off business owners having this conversation, and I realized that there's certain things that our point of view just might not even see from that. And I kind of brought up a similar hypothetical or revolving around basic income, because that's kind of my pet project. So I was yeah, let's say we have one candidate on the ballot who supports basic income and three who don't, but they're better than this bad guy. How, I have, ultimately as a voter, you have to make that choice. How important is this to me? Do I die on this hill and only vote for the person who I really like, or do I settle for these other people? So yeah, that was one of the things that occurred to me, but I do think that it has an even broader significance when you look at it through this lens. So I appreciate
I mean, yeah, and I guess this is where I get very frustrated with some of the approval voting advocates, especially the leadership that, clearly if they do not know better, it is through sort of active ignorance. Is why wouldn't you think about the fact that you live in a country that is hundreds of years old and has experimented with voting rights for people of color for a couple decades and seems to be really lurching backwards, why wouldn't you think that that is something to consider? I mean, what does that say about how serious you are about democracy reform? The sort of other thing is that I'm not considering that. I've talked to the approval voting leadership team, and we've had as soon as I started, I brought these up. Other organizations of color started bringing up these concerns, and it became really evident very early into the conversation. They just said like no consideration at all of voting rights. Not just of like how the system would play out for voters of color, but no consideration about the fact that there are voting rights protections that you have to comply with. You can't just invent a system or grab a system that works well on your spreadsheet, but may, have disastrous effects in the real world. That's a lot messier than the mathematical models that, you might be running on Excel. So you're right that if you were picking that up, that also like from my conversations I had the same thing. The reason that you'd want ranked choice voting even in that system, and again, what do you really want are proven solutions to these problems, and there are proven solutions. Like we are one of three countries that have winner take all politics on the level that we do. Every other country, especially countries that have had histories of racial conflict and systemic racism and bigotry, they have proportional systems for a reason. These are very old problems. How do we decide who represents us? And what are the best systems? There are solutions that are out there, and there's no reason to be inventing the wheel. So you want, voting rights remedies like proportional ranked choice voting that are used by the Justice Department to resolve voting rights issues. In Washington State, when we had our first case under the Washington State Voting Rights Act, and the Latino and Native communities were seeking representation and the protection of their voting rights in Yakima County. What they asked for was proportional ranked choice voting. So it's a solution, but even, absent that, because we have, there's a ban on the top two primary creates a sort of like ban on that system. Ranked choice voting is still better because it allows people to have a backup choice. And it allows people to unspool their preferences. So if, let's say you're a Black voter and there's a candidate who's also Black but doesn't share your politics, there's, might be coded as centrist, right? Maybe the way like people think of Mayor Harrell. And maybe you also really care about income inequality or wealth inequality or housing. Great. And there are candidates who aren't Black, but they are really good on those issues. And then there are candidates that are looking to roll back, police reforms, or are looking to ramp up incarceration, or are going to roll back civil rights protections, right? So things are bad. So you might actually end up with a situation where that voter like doesn't feel feel cornered and might say, you know what, actually, housing is more important to me than descriptive representation. So I'm going to vote for this. Maybe it's just like a white guy who's really good on housing. I'm going to rank them first. But if I don't have someone that shares these issues or shares my politics, or I think is going to be a really good person to fix some of the systemic problems in the city, I at least want someone who knows where I'm coming from. So maybe I rank the Black candidate second, and whoever, whatever third, and then I don't rank these other candidates, and I share that. And then all of a sudden you can have a situation where now that voter's gotten to kind of express themselves fully in a way that they wouldn't under the current system where you get one choice, or under approval voting where their vote for one candidate counts just as much as their vote for the second, and they might actually impede their first choice. They might undermine their first choice by approving of another candidate, which usually leads a lot of people under approval voting, at least the limited data we have, from only approving of one candidate. And it also creates different incentives for the candidates who are running, because maybe that black candidate who wasn't so good on housing starts to hear a little bit more about this, the housing candidate, what they have to offer. Maybe they cut an ad together. You might not necessarily have that. You definitely don't have that under our current system. And you might not have it under approval voting because that collaboration, the incentive isn't there, because the candidates know that they might undermine each other. And now you start getting into a situation where you have, a little bit more of a positive sum game for our politics. And people are, feel empowered to vote for their first choice preferences and not just think about the kind of negatives. It's also important to think I'll do two more examples, like your UBI situation. Maybe it is UBI is your top issue, but the person who's for UBI is basically also really racially regressive, right? Or they've had a terrible scandal that really speaks to a level of the character that you don't approve of, and or maybe they're Islamophobic, right? They're not completely racist, but they're really Islamophobic. What is that? That puts you in a tough place.
Yeah.
Because you're not able to actually say or create the incentives for somebody else to join. And if you approve of that candidate because you approve of the UBI platform, that vote is going to count just as much as another person's. And it's not actually your views, right? Your views are you care about a whole bunch of things. You care about UBI. You also might care about equality, and you also care about people with good character. And approval voting isn't set up for you to actually share your preferences. It's only set up to share tolerance. And then you might actually push some people who maybe don't have your values to approve of someone who's Islamophobic just because they're for UBI, right? So you're creating these bad incentives for let's say just normie white people who don't read the New York Times bestselling books, or aren't up on racial justice, or don't have a lot of people of color as friends. That's a huge, that's a huge constituency. The median voter in the US is a white person with no college degree. So, you want a system that also gives those kind of voters that are not actively bigoted, being racist isn't their whole thing, but they do hold kind of racially regressive views, and they are perfectly open and tolerant of racist candidates and politicians. You want to give them a kind of out, you want to give a kind of release valve for that. So you might play that out and see okay, you have a different election, and maybe one that described, a group of candidates that are pretty racist or pretty bigoted against people experiencing houselessness or whatever. And you have a group of candidates with middle of the road solutions. They're not going to fix anything systemically, but they're not going to make things actively worse. And a couple racially progressive candidates, maybe, candidates who their identity codes them in a certain way, because they're Hindi or whatever, you might have. Now that candidate who might be open to racism, okay, I might think that a kind of Trumpy candidate who's a former, entertaining to them, regressive they might, whatever, that's their first choice. But when they think about their second choice, even if they are, anti-immigrant and there's, an immigrant candidate, but that immigrant candidate is really good on their issue, whatever it might be, fixing the roads. Now they think like, well, yeah, I don't, I have like these kind of subtle anti-immigrant views, but if they're gonna fix the roads, sure, why not? I can have them as my backup choice to this candidate that like is and shares like my bigoted views. So even then, you end up with a situation where you can get people who are racist voting for anti-racism, just by the fact that you're going to have it as a backup choice. Under approval voting, you're asking that person to put those things on the same level. And this is what I mean by if you think the problem in American politics is the fact that we've never been a multiracial democracy and we don't have the institutions or structures or incentives for one, you want a system that both allows communities of color and people who believe in racial justice to advance that without risking a situation where racially regressive candidates move forward, or racially regressive politics move forward. So you have a kind of like backup choice. But you also want a system that gives, people with racist attitudes a way to support anti-racist politics. Right? And you see this like all the time with, if you think, it happens very rarely in the single choice elections we have, but you could go back to old clips of Obama campaigning in '08, and you have people who have really racially regressive views, who, liked what he had to say about getting out of Iraq or what have you. And what you want is not one person who's so charismatic they can win over those people. You want a system that every election after election, allows for people to like fully express their preferences. And then you start learning these things are complicated, and people aren't just what our current politics narrow them down to be or distill them to be. And maybe I can think of all sorts of times where I lived in the South. When we immigrated, we landed in South Carolina, lived in St. Louis for a while, lived in North Carolina. And, there are people who are really racially regressive in some situations on some days. And then on other days, are willing to entertain a progressive vision for the country or their city or their state. And you want, to have a system that can have the right incentives for that.
So just to kind of summarize here, my understanding is basically like in a situation like we have here, where you have a primary and then you have a top two general. The big difference here in terms of how it affects voters between approval and ranked choice voting is with approval voting, the largest block of voters, let's say they're the ones that support the performative leading moderate candidate, they can basically double their votes for another candidate that's similar. Whereas ranked choice voting, the people whose votes have not yet been cast, they suddenly have almost like more power in terms of, since their votes haven't been cast, their first choice didn't get in. Now they have more influence rather than that first block that already voted still having the dominant influence. Is that kind of
the thrust of it is right? I wouldn't say that that people would be able to double their votes in approval voting. It is just that not every voter would have the same incentives and would experience the election the same, because some voters who are not directly affected by the day-to-day governance of the city are able to approve a large range of set of politics. some of which make things worse for a minority of people, especially people who tend to be the most marginalized in the city. Or just because they're oblivious. I don't like ascribing kind of like bad motivations to those voters, because not everybody is paying attention to the news or what's happening in the city, and
Especially with local politics.
yeah, right. So who, does someone who, imagine someone just has no idea that there is a city attorney that's trying to increase the number of people that are jailed, even as we're in experiencing like the highest rates of mass incarceration in not just like the country's history, but in the world right now. Like, they don't know. Who knows?
I didn't know that.
So that's just to say that if one group of voters who have also been historically a group that's exercised the most, that's had the most political capital and power and voice, if they are able to approve of a large range of voters with and a minority of voters are have a much narrower set of politics that they approve of, one group has an advantage at the expense of the other, and that's why it's hard. So it's not even necessarily, and I wouldn't say they are doubling their votes. It's just that it creates really asymmetric incentives.
Okay. I want to bring up, I wonder if you have any insight to, there were some people who made similar claims about like ranked choice voting disaffecting communities of color or other marginalized groups. I know like during the New York primary, some people were talking about that. I tried to understand how that would be the case, and I couldn't, essentially. I was able to kind of see it with approval voting, where like, oh, this might be set up in a way. But with ranked choice voting, I didn't see it, but I did see people voicing that concerns. I wonder if you have an opinion on that.
Not a huge one. I mean, I think for people like you could just go out and see ranked choice elections and how they function. There's a lot of data and history in majority white jurisdictions, in majority black jurisdictions, in majority non-white jurisdictions, elections where there were a full range of different candidates, places that are as different as Alaska and Utah and, New York City or Mississippi for voters there. Like, in most states, there are some voters that are able to cast ranked choice ballots, including places like, I think, Alabama and Mississippi. So that's where, you just have to look at the reality and then judge for yourself. There's also tons of data and research on it. One is that communities of color actually tend to rank more candidates than white voters, which isn't to say that they have a larger voice, but actually start to see that they have a whole different set of preferences, because they have they want both descriptive representation that they've never had, but they also, it's not like they're a monolith. Like, just because black people vote 80 to 90% one way doesn't mean like 80 to 90% of black people voting that way have the same politics. They actually have very drastically different politics. And once you're able to rank your preferences, you start to see that. The other is, like, we also know that more women and people of color are elected when you have ranked choice elections. And part of that is because both of what I just described, for communities of color, but also for white people, like, it's not everything to them to have white candidates. And it, like, allows for more white people to help elect candidates, even if they're their backup choice. which, can't happen under single choice elections, can't happen under approval voting. And the only records we have of approval voting are just St. Louis, which is a majority minority city. So the election of the first black mayor is not all too surprising, especially when they were known character. They were the early on favorite to win that race, and then also ran in the wake of the largest civil rights mobilization the country's ever experienced. So there's lots of good reasons to think that Jones would have, who became the first black mayor, would have won under any voting system. And then, Fargo, North Dakota, which is, just has just over 100,000 residents. And so there's just not a lot of information there, but the information we do have is not great. So that's kind of what I would say. And if you talk to the candidates that ran and lost, like Maya Wiley had a great conversation with Fair Vote Washington recently, and with one of the big leaders on democracy reform, Senator Yasmin Trudeau, state senator. She was really happy with how that election went, even though she didn't win. She was really happy that she placed in the top 5, and she was able to run without tearing down, other candidates. So there's always going to be people who have criticisms of any system. There's no system that's perfect, and we're not actually trying to find the perfect system, right? We're trying to find the system that is most conducive and most inclusive to multiracial democracy.
That was one of the things that I loved about that New York election, was seeing, I think it was Garcia who kind of campaigned with Yang towards the end of that race, and it was just refreshing to see two candidates actually uniting on something, even though they definitely had their differences. It was such a change and a breath of fresh air from what we usually see, where it's so cutthroat.
Yeah, and I think it was just after that election that Andrew Yang joined the board of Fair Vote National. Because I think he kind of, gets the incentive things, and, you didn't see any of the fallout or the coronation or, the things that you might have seen with the 2016 Democratic primary or the 2020 Democratic primary, where people are still fighting over, what actually happened, who actually won, who was cheated. It was just, it's not like Eric Adams was, some super popular person among people who are really online discussing these things. But people thought that it was legitimate, which is, again, one of the big problems is, and one of the turning points with the 2000 elections, there were millions of people who thought that was illegitimate. There were millions of people who thought that 2016 election was illegitimate, and on and on. But that was the largest election using ranked choice voting in America, and someone who wasn't the most exciting to some of the most engaged progressives still ended up, people felt like it was legitimate. If you ask New York voters, and we saw this in the polling after the election, they didn't want to go back to having just one choice. They wanted to be able to express their full preferences and not have their first choice be their last choice.
Yeah. And I know that Andrew Yang was one of the people who also publicly said to him, he is supportive of approval voting and ranked choice voting. And as someone who I see as a leader on the voting rights issue, that was another sign to me, oh, these must both be good. But I also am aware that I love Andrew Yang for a lot of reasons, but social justice and race-related issues isn't necessarily a strong point. So it was also something where I'm not sure how much he's thought about this through this lens, which is why I kind of wanted to delve deeper with somebody who is looking at this stuff through this perspective.
Yeah, and I think in his view, like if I remember like some of his statements are basically like anything is better than what we have now. Which like I mean sure. Also that's true, but it doesn't seem like the kind of thing where he's making like a strong policy recommendation or endorsement just kind of on the face of it. And I'm sure if he learned about some of the issues this has, he'd have hesitations too. The other thing that is really important when you're thinking about these voting systems is where you're able to rank candidates. It's again kind of positive, creates positive sum incentives. Even under approval voting, you can have where candidates do have an incentive to close ranks. It's when they are trying to decide against or one particular candidate, because approval voting can very easily create an anyone but X situation. And so a lot of this discussion has been like what happens in a place that's really progressive, like Seattle, or at least has that reputation or appearance. But what happens when places that do want to have a plurality of voters dictate the outcome of the general election that aren't so progressive? What happens when some of these counties and cities and jurisdictions that do want to find ways to dilute the voting power of communities of color start thinking like, oh, approval voting would be a great way for us to say that we're reforming our democracy while actually diluting the voting power of communities of color. And that to me is kind of also one of the more dangerous things about the precedents they're setting. And from my discussions with the leaders of the approval voting movement, they don't consider this at all. They haven't thought about it. There's no plan for if it happens. There's no commitment to trying to ensure that doesn't happen, which is dangerous to me.
Yeah, so essentially when I try to bring this kind of aspect up to Logan, like what he kind of said is with approval voting, yeah, like if you have a place like Seattle that's like heavily blue, they're going to become more blue probably. In a place that's like heavily red, they'll likely become more red. And the way he phrased it was like, because it makes democracy work better. So if it's going to push more to the extremes in terms of what the majority in any given area believes. So on that note, do you think that there's any merit or, I guess, positive attributes coming out of the idea of something that pushes people to more of a compromise, in terms of like we're living in such a polarized time, so many people are going further this way, further that way, and it seems like there's a bigger gap in the middle. In that sense, is there a benefit to having a system that kind of leans towards a more centrist or moderate candidate, or is that just something we tell ourselves so that we can not pay attention to the communities that are being disaffected?
I think you're onto something with that last point about it becomes very easy to say, well, this is the person that's most tolerated. That's just how it is. But more, I think that worries me is people won't see that system as legitimate. And, democracy is a long-term game. You're not trying to solve something just now or the next election cycle, or solve this small problem, which is what they promise, right? Here's one small tweak to our system could create more representative elections. You have to address the problem, and your system has to actually have legitimacy. Like, things are already falling apart in St. Louis over the approval voting. Lots of the Black organizations don't like the fact that they don't have the ability to express their full range of preferences. They're trying to get it repealed. Dartmouth, which was, prior to 2019, I think was the largest place that had used approval voting. They repealed it because of some of these tactical problems. So, you know, that's worrying to me. You don't have the same issue with ranked choice voting where places that have it keep it. The other thing, I don't think it's great that, um, you know, approval voting would have some of those polarizing incentives because again, aren't people don't think of themselves as blue or red or just in one dimension. People are multi-dimensional, they're multifaceted, they care about a whole lot of issues. And right now the problem is that we're not just polarized across one set of things, but we have compounding polarization where you're polarized across like many different issues, and that creates really really high stakes where there's lots of people who feel like um, the outcome of the next election could have pose a real danger to their lives, and they're right in a lot of those situations. You don't want a system that is, going to just ratchet that up. You want a system that's going to be able to work through those conflicts in a way, really tough conflicts, right? By the way, but in a way that has trust and legitimacy. Um, and I just really doubt that approval voting would have that.
You mentioned earlier that some people speculate that a place like Seattle, because it's known for being more quote unquote progressive, that could kind of change how this would play out. Do you think that that is the case? That like because Seattle's not a place where you're likely to get like a far right Republican candidate coming in and barging on the doors, or if they do, they're not going to get very far. Do you think that just the demographics here and the fact that people here, at least seem to try to be conscious about, progressive issues, do you think that that would help if this were to pass? Or do you think, no, it's just like systematically setting things up in a way that's not going to be good?
Um, I always try to be little have some humility about predicting things. It's hard to speculate about what will and won't happen. I think what is definitely true is first, if approval voting does pass, people are going to put two and two together about who has disproportionate influence in the candidates that come out of the primary. It's like white voters. And do they have voting protections? Like, yeah, voters of color in Washington State do have voting protections. State voting protections, not to mention the Voting Rights Act, or even the 14th Amendment, because approval voting has actually never withstood any legal scrutiny anywhere, because we're talking about something that got implemented in its first U.S. election 3 years ago. So there's a lot of questions, and so there's going to be a vote. Someone's going to issue a voting rights lawsuit. So that isn't speculation, right? Instead of many voters of color, someone's going to want to know whether their voting rights are being violated. And again, approval voting has no plan for that. I've talked to them several times. They've never even thought about it prior to the first time we met. The other thing is that we do know and don't have to speculate about is that it's not going to have trust and legitimacy because it doesn't have a track record. There's tons of questions about how easily it is to tactically game the outcomes. So, like, one of the reasons that Dartmouth College repealed it, even for selecting its student government and its alumni board, is because you had candidates who were getting elected after being the first choice of 6% of the voters wasn't great for the student government alumni. Don't know why people think it'll be great for selecting the mayor, the city council, when the stakes are much higher. You're talking about homelessness and police violence and lots of other really contentious issues. Um, and the repeal efforts that are happening in St. Louis is another great sign that it won't have a lot of trust and legitimacy. And I don't think that's very productive, especially when there are tested and proven solutions. And it really baffles me why people would invest so much in an effort knowing that that is what's going to be what's going to happen, and not really having a plan for it other than the fact that they're not really on the hook for a voting rights lawsuit. The city and taxpayers are. They're not really going to, they're not the ones who are going to have their voting rights violated, right? Because it's, while I met with them, it was, you know, a, like a principal, like a legal counsel for Microsoft, and startup executive, and a pot shop executive. So then for them, I guess they see themselves as kind of not having anything to lose, and fine experimenting with something that's pretty important to people, their voting rights. And they're fine if people end up having their voting rights violated and it gets fixed. But of course, people never get that election back, and that election has might carry life and death consequences. So, and not something that I would gamble on or roll the dice on or want to speculate about. I'd rather try to make a decision around what seems pretty certain, and avoid, signing this, and instead of like put my energy behind proven solutions where communities of color are leading on them, and where it's very much possible that next year, if approval voting doesn't pass, that voters would have the ability to use ranked choice voting for or elect to use ranked choice voting for the primary election, as we work on some of the other big reforms at the state level.
So one of the things that Logan brought up was how long he thinks it will take to get a ranked choice voting initiative passed. And that was one of the things that he said was like an advantage of approval voting. It's like if ranked choice voting is going to be, so he put it, he said, unlikely to be implemented until the 2030s. So if that's the case, we're looking at, a decade of the current system. So in that sense, looking at approval voting versus the current system, both being flawed, are we still feeling like staying with the current system is still better than trying out this experimental thing that may end up being worse? And how do we, like he said, the mathematical models only go so far. We need real life tests to actually figure out what works and what doesn't. How do we get those tests going if taking that chance could end up being like harmful to those communities that we might want to help? How do we figure out what works? How do we do those tests without accidentally stepping on those communities along the way?
Yeah. Did Logan give a source for why he thinks it would take so long?
He may have provided a reason. I would have to re-listen.
Oh, I mean, yeah, sure. I'm sure there's like some sort of thing, but my guess is that he has not talked to King County elections or any election clerks, or any groups that are working on this, because that's just kind of absurd. There's no reason, there's no law that says if you elect to choose ranked choice voting, you can't start until 2030. Like that's just made up. there's no reason that you wouldn't be able to elect to use ranked choice voting and then have that system implemented. It's not like there haven't been ranked choice voting elections. There are people who get really technical about it on the software, but Alaska and Utah, 40 jurisdictions in Utah seem to do it pretty fine. Lots of other cities. And the other thing is, we have talked to King County elections. We've talked to election clerks and county clerks around the state have been working on implementing ranked choice voting through workshops and other things about how you would administer those elections and what systems you need. All these things are answered. And so I think it's just, there's no other way to say it. Like, it's just like flatly wrong. And I would, before taking that on its face, ask the groups that have been working on it or who are working on it and the actual election administrators about why it would take a decade to implement something that's in place in a lot of places.
So from where you're sitting and with what you know about it, I know that like there was recently a proposition for ranked choice voting that was brought up and then didn't go through.
King County.
Yeah, with just kind of what you know of the situation, what do you think would be the best case scenario of like the soonest chance that we would be able to get something like this actually in place?
There's nothing that would prevent us from, the next opportunity would be, so this year was focused on trying to have the best system you can, which is you have for single winner offices like mayor or city attorney where there's just one. You can have one election where you collapse the primary and the general. And for a city council, you make the city council proportional by both increasing the number of seats that are available and having multi-member districts. That would then mean that if you're 15% of the city, 20% of the city, 30% of the city, you're able to elect 15%, 20%, 30% of the districts. That's currently not true and would be really important, especially for the Black community. There's no Black city council member, and more to the point, Black people in Seattle aren't able to elect a candidate of their choice, which is pretty drastic, especially when you think about the history there and the central district. When it comes to how quickly you could implement it, the next possible time for Seattle to choose to move to ranked choice voting would be 2023, so next year. And there's no reason why if the election administrators and King County elections wanted to, you couldn't have and use ranked choice voting when they're creating those next ballots in 2025. Those are things for election administrators and clerks and experts to sort out. But again, there's no law that says that you have to wait X amount of years for ranked choice voting, but you could use approval voting the very next cycle.
So I think I had something to do, and I should probably re-listen to the conversation, but this is also why I think it'd be useful to have you two talk it together at some point, because I know there are gaps in my own knowledge in terms of this stuff. I think he was talking about something to do with the difference in between approaches, between it being a city thing versus a county thing versus a state thing, and maybe that had something to do with it. But again, I know there are gaps in my knowledge in this, so I can't properly.
I think what he's so I think what he's talking about is that, and this gets very wonky, but there are changes to city law that you can make, like I believe on even years, and this is even like so in the weeds that I'd have to have a refresher on it. But you can change some things on even years, and you can change the charter which is like the city constitution,
Yeah.
on odd years, and that's the difference in the types of initiatives that happen. And so then I think part of how he gets to a decade is imagining, well, if need to ramp up a campaign and the next opportunity is 2025, and then it takes 2 cycles to implement it, then you're up to 2029, and that's kind of close to 2030. Like, that's the only way I could see this happening. I think that's what he means when he's talking about when he commend this. But again, 2023 is an odd year, so you can move that change that way, and there's lots of voting rights organizations and organizations of color that have been planning and working on doing so. There's
That was
also
going to be my next
yeah.
question, was are the Washington Community Alliance or Fair Vote Washington or some other organization actively working to make that happen in 2023?
Yeah, I think, for us, we've been wanting to get the solutions that we know work. People having more than just one choice and the ability to rank their preferences. People having the confidence of knowing that they have an equal voice at the ballot box and have proportional representation, and doing that as quickly as possible, which is why we were pushing for a bill that would lift the ban on most cities and counties on using different electoral systems. So, like right now, most jurisdictions in Washington State actually can't reform their elections to move to use ranked choice voting. Only they're called like tier 1 cities can do that, and even then just for the primary, right? So we're working hard on that. The session ended last week, and that bill just narrowly failed, like a lot of others, including like the governor's bill for housing and a bunch of other things. And so now we're thinking about the next best thing, and 2023 is going to be a big year, not just for Seattle, but for other places across the state.
Awesome. We've talked a lot about how the primary and general election impact these different voting systems, but I'm curious for some clarification. If approval voting were to be implemented in a place outside of Washington that didn't have the rule about a top 2 general, would it still have the same negative consequences, or would it be less harmful in a place that didn't have that?
It's always, again, it's hard to just speculate and imagine, and I'm not even sure like entirely how valuable that is, but you can be certain of a couple things. Like, one is, in every jurisdiction, you will have a system where no one can communicate their first choice preference, which also means you can have a system that is able to elect people was able to elect a candidate without that candidate being the first choice of anyone at all. Just someone who is tolerated by a plurality of people, not anyone who is preferred by anyone. So that's just approval voting, as like it's set up anywhere and everywhere you build in. You're going to have a situation where communities of color, and especially communities that are tend to be the most marginalized, are forced into tactical voting in a way that voters who are white and wealthier and homeowners and quite comfortable with a large range of politics do not have those tactical issues. And you're going to have a voting system that empowers a slim plurality of voters to be able to dictate the outcomes for the whole electorate. And that's like, regardless. Now, where you in places that are hostile to voting rights, those people are going to, they're going to have their voting rights violated, but they're not going to have a remedy. The voting rights protections aren't they are like a backstop and a way to get redress after your voting rights have been violated, right? In the Yakima case, there are voters who lived their whole lives having their voting rights violated, never got to participate in an election where they had an equal say in who represented them until, because there wasn't a loss until just a couple of years ago. And voting rights protections at the state level until just a couple of years ago. And, there are people who are fine with that, I guess. And that's just not me. I think like that's a big problem and something that everyone should be invested in solving.
So for those people who are here living in Seattle and who saw the petitioners out there collecting signatures for approval voting, who maybe were confused about it or thought it was similar to ranked choice voting or thought that both would be just as good for the community, but who maybe have learned more like I have about this and maybe don't feel like they maybe don't feel so good about having given that signature. What's the process for trying to take the signature off of a petition?
Anyone can contact, believe it's Seattle elections and King County elections and take the signature off. I mean, I really think the plan is if you care about solving our very terrible and not good single choice elections, you should decline to sign. You should then think about what role you can play to advance a system where you get to actually express your full range of preferences, who's your first choice, who are your backups, think what role you would play in bring that to Seattle and look at what groups are doing to advance that. So people can visit representingwa.org. So representingwa.org. It's a big coalition that includes organizations like Care Washington, which is a organization in the Muslim community, the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle, Black organization, youth-led organizations like the Washington Bus, and others. Make that plan and follow it and see how you can join that effort. This year, San Juan and Clark County are going to be voting on using ranked choice voting. So we do know that people are kind of sick of being forced to only have one choice. They want the freedom to be able to express their full preferences. And we're going to get electoral reform one way or another, and it's just a question of do we get the kind of reforms that are conducive to multiracial democracy that have been tried and proven in a whole bunch of places, or do we try to experiment with untested reforms and roll the dice on to find out whether they're harmful or have some benefits.
Real briefly, I'm curious if you have an opinion on star voting, which is the other popular voting system that's discussed a lot in these conversations.
Honestly, I don't.
That's okay too.
It's just, it kind of goes back to something I mentioned, which is these are not new problems. They don't need new solutions. They're just hard problems because there are people who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, maintaining the current system, which isn't even to say that those people are bad people. If you're the head of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, it's your job to maintain this zero-sum, winner-takes-all system because that's the system that gets your candidates elected. You actually don't have a charter, even if you might say it, to care about voter preferences or this and that. And that's not to the equivalent of the two, because those are very different political parties with different constituencies. Like one has a base of voters that's black and brown voters, I would say largely out of necessity than out of preference, but that's the case. The other is like 80-90% white, and with a third of them, being very far right extremists. So not the same, but like there literally are no. If you become the head of the Democratic Party, like that's what you just have to do that, and so basically, I think that these, when you come with star voting or any of the other voting methods, there's just not a ton of solutions. It's not like it's not rocket science. It's like, how do you get people to communicate what they want in an election? Like, there's not like a lot of ways to go about that. How do you ensure that the share of votes is reflected in the share of seats in power? Not a lot of ways to do that. And there are a lot of elections that happen. And do the elections where people rank their choices rather than use different methods go better? Yes. Do most people who have a ranked choice ballot want to keep it? Yes. And why do they want to? Because that's how you decide on most things. You don't show up to a restaurant and say, hey, I'd like menu option number 1, and whether they've sold out or not sold out of that option, you don't really get a backup. You say like, hey, I'd really want this thing on the menu, but if you're out of that, I want this other thing. In other words, you rank your preferences. Yeah. You don't need like a complex scoring system for that. And people intuitively know that it's fair that if your coalition or your voting bloc is 30% gets 30% of the votes, you should have 30% of the seats. And that's the system that's set up everywhere. That's a system that our State Department, when it's advising other countries, new countries, on how to set up their system, they always recommend a proportional system, which is very ironic given our structure. And the so that's mainly what I think whenever I hear about these other reforms is, what problem do they think they're solving? Is that the actual problem in American elections? And what evidence do they have that they solve the problem in American elections? And have they thought about these things? And my sense, very shortly from just like seeing how they talk about these things online, is that they don't really think about what does the Voting Rights Act do? What was it meant to do? How would the system work in communities that are highly segregated, like what the Voting Rights Act was set up to do, create representation when communities are really densely packed together? And what does it do when they're not? Which is what our system struggles with right now. When there's not as much segregation, you can't draw as many majority-minority districts to give those communities the ability to elect candidates of choice. People should just remember that this isn't complicated. It's difficult because of the politics and the histories and the vested interest in the system. But it's not like some novel or complex issue. It's just like, how do we choose who we want to represent us? How do we make sure that our institutions are representative? And those have old solutions.
Yeah. So that kind of segues well into my next question, which is, to some degree, it seems like whatever voting system we have if we're operating in some kind of democracy, more or less, and we're living in a white-dominated country, white-dominated society, it feels like that by its very nature is going to marginalize people who are on the outskirts or who don't fall into the biggest voting bloc. So is this even a problem that voting reform can begin to address, or is this something that needs to be tackled culturally or intellectually?
um, it's definitely electoral reform isn't a panacea to like solve everything, but it is very revelatory because you just you need to have a system and incentives that don't collapse everyone into um, just their worst base instincts. One of the things I would think about is people, I mean, bad things are not all that popular most of the time. Like at the time we were talking about when the country's founding, where most people were disenfranchised. Um, slavery was not like a widely popular issue for most people. Most people did not benefit greatly from it. It was a handful of very, very rich financiers and enslavers. And when we did start to see more people getting access to the franchise after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, where you start to see all of a sudden legislatures in the South electing black representatives, black governors. A large part of that was they had tried to generate ways of getting proportional representation. New York City, which just had ranked choice voting elections this last cycle, was one of the largest and biggest places that used proportional representation following Reconstruction. And again, it didn't eliminate racism, but also racism isn't the number one issue for most people. It's not the number one issue for most white people. But when you have a zero-sum game where you tell white voters, hey, you live in a systemically racist country where we have a hierarchy of human value and you are on the highest rung of that hierarchy, and people of color are at the bottom, and you get one choice, and where more people get representation, you might get less. Like, people are people and they have incentives, and so if you create incentives for them to operate on their worst instincts, you're gonna end up with a lot of racist people being like, yeah, I kind of fucked up that there are people at the bottom of the rung, but that's not me, and I don't know if I don't want to be on top. Um, and so what you want is a system that solves for that and actually gives those people um, a follow-up question of like, what if it didn't have to be this way and zero sum? And maybe they still, vote for racist candidates, but now there's on their ballot is a second choice and a third choice and a fourth choice and a fifth choice. And you open up room for someone to talk to them and be like, okay, it's, you're very into far right, maybe Trump like candidates, and they have a daughter or a cousin or a friend or a coworker who talks to them and be like, okay, I can't convince you that, this kind of far right candidate isn't your favorite. But can we agree that we want better transit? Are you willing to rank this transit candidate second or third? Just creates for better politics, and you just realize that there are always going to be a minority of people, yeah, who their main thing is maintaining racial hierarchy in this country, but that's not most people. And under the right incentives and also like the incentive for most people to operate, they are generally on board with equality and fairness and justice and proportionality. And I think that's what you see when from places that are very, very conservative, like Utah, places that people think are very conservative but have great things going on and really innovative, like Alaska. Alaska also has like a social wealth fund that cuts a check to its residents at over $1,000 a year. They get a stimulus every year. They have social ownership over some of their resources and wealth, you start to see like, oh, like, and those are people who identify as conservatives, right? So there's more to it than just that one label. To places that are as as uh, left as Brooklyn and uh, New York. So that's mainly what I think is it doesn't get rid of um, racism, but it does get rid of systemic racism in our elections and our electoral system, and that's a huge step forward and one worth working towards.
Absolutely. Well, I think you kind of already talked about this, but it's important, so I'm going to ask one more time. For the average person watching who wants to help try to make our democracy better, where can they go? What can they do?
It's great. I think if you are watching and you care a lot about trying to win a multiracial democracy and try to have one in this country for the first time, the best place to start is finding organizations that are working towards those solutions, like ranked choice voting, proportional representation. And if you're in Seattle, representing wa.org is a great place to go. Washington Community Alliance is a great place to go. We have a great newsletter, comes out regularly, and it's pretty fun and has tips and things for people to do, as well as ways that you can talk about these issues to your friends and family and coworkers, and hopefully it leads to us getting better elections and a better democracy soon.
Absolutely. That sounds great to me. Thank you so much for taking the time. Do you have any plugs you want to drop, projects you're working on, social media you want to share, anything like that?
No, I think those are the main plugs. If people go to wacommunityalliance.org, there's a donate button. That's always helpful to help fuel some of this work.
Yeah.
We also really do have a great and fun newsletter. We were tracking legislation during the session. It's funny and short. Comes out every week during session. Outside of legislative session, I think we keep it to every 2 weeks, and I think it's something that people should try. They can read the blog version if they want to try that, and it's completely free. So great way to learn about what's happening and the organizations working on these issues.
Great. And is there anything that you feel like I missed? Is there anything you wish you had gotten to mention during this conversation that you feel like I overlooked?
No, I think we covered a lot. Maybe one of the things that I would just mention is, I had this piece with Jasmine, is the political director at the Washington Bus, and Colin Cole, who's a political director at More Equitable Democracy. And a lot of it was working through some of these claims and promises of approval voting. And then, the note that we're trying to end on was, this is actually like really critical for solving any number of the problems we're talking about. Especially ones that, urbanists recognize, like density in cities. We have to have, trusted and legitimate governance of cities that's done in an equitable way, because that's the context for generating, economic prosperity and making sure that it's as widely shared as possible. You really can't have that happen without the context of multiracial democracy and social trust that is like so integral to sustaining a lot of those gains. And that's just as important for people who are starting small businesses that want to make sure that the regulations are fair and everyone's playing by the same rules, to communities that want public safety in general, not just from people who are committing crimes, but also the people they call to in an emergency. They don't want that to turn into itself to create a public safety problem with police violence. All of the big issues need, like, at the start and upstream, to be solved with an electoral system that actually creates the right incentives for the politicians who aren't trusted to address those issues.
Well, let's make it happen then.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kamau. I really appreciate you taking the time. This is
Thanks.
super valuable for me. And I
How
feel
long
like
was
I learned a
that?
lot.
That was long form.
That was. Let's see. What do we got? We got an hour and 57 minutes. And there we have it. Almost 2 hours long, making that my longest podcast yet. I hope that you got something out of it. I thought it was really informative. When it comes to the overall question at hand, will I support approval voting? At this point, I'm probably going to hold off and push for some ranked choice voting here in Seattle because I want to listen to the communities that say that they're being pushed out. And I think it's important that we make our democracy reform as beneficial for everyone as possible. But I'd be really interested to hear what your thoughts are if you listen to this conversation or you listen to my previous conversation with Logan and you want to let me know what you think about approval voting or ranked choice voting. Post it in the comments. I'll definitely be reading those. And if you want to see more conversations like this, subscribe, check out the channel, and I will be bringing you more content soon. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you have a great day. See you next time.